The auctioneer's hammer crashed down like thunder, and Caspian Wilder's heart shattered with it. Sold. Miss Delphine Rosecroft's hand in marriage to Mayor Bartholomew Grimsby for the sum of $3,000. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Caspian heard nothing except the roar of blood in his ears. His calloused hands gripped the wooden rail of the auction platform until his knuckles turned white as bone. Delphine stood frozen on the stage, her cornflower blue dress fluttering in the evening breeze, her emerald eyes wide with horror as she stared directly at him. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. Wait. Caspian's voice cut through the celebration like a blade. The crowd fell silent, 200 faces turning toward him. Mayor Grimsby, a portly man with silver whiskers and cruel eyes, frowned from his position near the front. Caspian vaulted over the rail and strode onto the platform, his worn leather boots echoing against the wooden boards. The auctioneer, Josiah Blackthorne, raised his eyebrows in surprise. "The bidding's closed, son," Blackthorne said, but his voice carried uncertainty. "I wasn't finished," Caspian replied, his voice steady despite the hurricane raging in his chest. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch, along with a folded document. $4,000 cash and the deed to my ranch. The crowd gasped. Mayor Grimsby's face purpled. "This is preposterous. The auction is over." Actually, Blackthorne examined the deed with growing interest. According to territorial law, as long as the bride hasn't left the platform, additional bids can be accepted. He looked up at Caspian with newfound respect. "Son, do you understand? What you're offering? The Wilder Ranch has been in your family for 30 years. It's worth 10 times what you're bidding." Caspian's eyes never left Delphine's face. She was crying now, tears streaming down her porcelain cheeks, but he couldn't tell if they were tears of joy or despair. "I know exactly what I'm offering," he said quietly. "Everything I have in this world." The story behind this moment stretched back 15 years, to a time when Delphine Rosecroft was nothing more than a wild-haired girl who climbed trees and caught fireflies in mason jars. Caspian had been 17 then, already working his father's ranch. When the Rosecroft family moved to Willowbrook Valley from back east, Delphine was 12. All knees and elbows and fierce determination, he remembered the first time he saw her standing in the middle of Cottonwood Creek in her Sunday dress, trying to catch minnows with her bare hands, when she slipped and fell face first into the water. Caspian had jumped in without thinking, pulling her to shore despite her indignant protests that she could swim just fine. "Thank you very much." From that day forward, they were inseparable. He taught her to ride horses and rope cattle. She taught him to read beyond his basic schooling and showed him that there was beauty in wildflowers and poetry in thunderstorms. As the years passed and Delphine grew from a gangly girl into the most beautiful woman in 3 counties, their friendship deepened into something neither dared speak aloud. Now, facing financial ruin after her father's death and the discovery of his massive gambling debts, Delphine had been forced into this medieval spectacle a bride auction to save her family's honor and pay their creditors. "Delphine," Caspian called softly, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Will you have me?" Delphine's lips parted, but before she could speak, Mayor Grimsby stepped forward, his walking stick tapping angrily against the platform boards. "This is absurd," Grimsby sputtered, his substantial belly straining against his gold-buttoned vest. "I had a legal agreement. The highest bid wins the lady's hand, and I bid first." "But not highest," Blackthorne corrected, studying the deed in his weathered hands. "Young Wilder here has offered $4,000 in cash, plus property valued at—" He squinted at the document. "Sweet Mary and Joseph. $45,000. The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. Caspian's jaw tightened as he watched understanding dawn on faces throughout the gathering. He wasn't just bidding for Delphine's hand, he was sacrificing everything his family had built, everything he'd ever known for love. Delphine stepped forward, her hands trembling. "Caspian, no, you can't do this. The ranch is your life. Your heritage, you're my life," he interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. "You always have been." Mayor Grimsby's face had progressed from purple to an alarming shade of crimson. I won't stand for this. There are procedures, protocols. Miss Rosecroft, surely you can't consider accepting this. It's this theatrical gesture over a stable, established offer from a man of standing in the community. Delphine's green eyes flashed. With sudden fire? A man of standing? You mean a man who proposed marriage to me through a livestock auction? Who bid on me like I was a prize heifer? Her voice rose, carrying clearly across the crowd. Who, I should mention, has 3 wives. Buried in the Willowbrook Cemetery under suspiciously similar circumstances, the crowd stirred uneasily. Grimsby's reputation for outliving wives was well known, but rarely spoken aloud. Now, see here, young lady, Grimsby began, raising his walking stick. Caspian moved faster than anyone expected. His hand shot out and caught the mayor's wrist in a grip that made the older man gasp. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Grimsby. His voice was quiet, but it carried the promise of violence. Gentlemen, please. Blackthorn stepped between them. The matter is simple, Miss Rosecroft. The choice is yours. The law requires you to accept the highest bidder, but you have the right to refuse any bid that makes you fear for your safety or well-being. Delphine looked from Grimsby's sweating, furious face to Caspian's earnest blue eyes. The choice should have been simple, but accepting Caspian's offer meant watching him lose everything he'd worked for his entire life. There has to be another way, she whispered. There isn't, her mother, Cordelia Rosecroft, called from the crowd. The elegant woman pushed through the gathering, her black mourning dress stark against the evening sky. Your father's debts total $8,000. Without this marriage settlement, we'll lose everything anyway, and you'll be left destitute. Then I'll work, Delphine said defiantly. I'll find employment. I'll doing what? Grimsby sneered, having recovered his composure. There's no work for a woman of your station, girl. You'll end up in the saloons or worse. Caspian's free. Hand clenched into a fist, but before he could move, Delphine stepped forward and placed her palm against his chest. If I accept your offer, she said quietly, looking up into his eyes, you lose your ranch, your home, everything your family built. If you don't accept it, he replied, covering her hand with his, I lose the only thing that ever mattered to. Me, anyway. The crowd held its collective breath as Delphine stared up at the man who'd been her dearest friend. Her secret love, her constant companion through 15 years of laughter and tears. She thought of summer afternoons spent riding across the endless grasslands of his ranch, of winter evenings by the fire, listening to him read aloud from books she'd chosen, of the way his eyes lit up when he laughed at her terrible jokes. She thought, too, of the alternative life as Bartholomew Grimsby's 4th wife, trapped in his mansion on the hill, slowly withering away like the women who'd come before her. Mr. Blackthorn, she said finally, her voice clear and strong, I accept Caspian Wilder's offer. The moment Delphine spoke those words, Mayor Grimsby exploded into motion. His walking stick swept toward Caspian's head with surprising speed. But years of ranch work had honed Caspian's reflexes to razor sharpness. He ducked, grabbed the stick, and with a sharp twist, sent it clattering across the platform. You'll regret this, boy, Grimsby hissed, his small eyes glittering with malice. Both of you will regret this decision before the week is out. Is that a threat? Caspian stepped forward, his tall frame casting a shadow over the shorter man. It's a promise, Grimsby replied, straightening his rumpled vest. I have considerable influence in this territory. I can make life very difficult for those who cross me. Blackthorn cleared his throat loudly. Gentlemen, please, we have legal matters to conclude. He turned to address the crowd. By the power vested in me, by the territorial government, I declare this auction concluded. Mr. Caspian Wilder has claimed Miss Delphine Rosecroft's hand in marriage with his winning bid. As the auctioneer began organizing the paperwork, Delphine found herself swept into her mother's tearful embrace. Oh, my darling girl, Cordelia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Are you certain about this? Once the papers are signed? I'm certain, Mother. Delphine squeezed her parents' hands. I've been certain for years. I was just too afraid to admit it. Meanwhile, Caspian was surrounded by his ranch hands' grizzled men who'd worked the Wilder spread for decades. Their faces showed a mixture of concern and admiration. "Boss," said Tobias Ironwood, the foreman, his weathered face grave, "you sure about this? So that spread's been in your family since before the war?" "I'm sure, Tobias." Caspian clasped the older man's shoulder. "Yes, I'm not losing the ranch. I'm gaining a partner to help run it. But the DDU signed it over. To pay her father's debts? Yes. But there's nothing stopping me from working the land, building it back up. Delphine and I will make it work." Tobias studied his young boss with eyes that had seen 3 decades of hardship and triumph. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Well, then I reckon we'd better start planning a wedding." As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about the evening's dramatic events, Caspian and Delphine found themselves alone on the platform for the first time. The sun had set completely now, and lanterns cast dancing shadows across their faces. "Walk with me?" Caspian asked, offering his arm. They strolled down Main Street in comfortable silence, past the general store and the church, toward the little white house where Delphine lived with her mother. The night air was sweet with the scent of honeysuckle, and filled with the gentle chorus of crickets. "Do you remember," Delphine said suddenly, "that time when I was 14, and I tried to break that wild Mustang your father brought in?" Caspian chuckled. "You mean when you nearly got yourself killed because you were too stubborn to admit you needed help?" "I wasn't stubborn. I was determined." She bumped his shoulder playfully. "There's a difference, is there now?" Stopped. Walking and turned to face her. The moonlight, she looked ethereal, like something from a fairy tale. "Delphine, I need you to know what I did tonight. I didn't do it to trap you or force your hand. If you want to call this off, if you want to find another way," she silenced him by pressing her fingers to his lips. "Caspian Wilder, do you remember what I told you the day I turned 18? Thought back to that day 3 years ago, when they'd been sitting by Cottonwood Creek watching the sunset? You said you'd already chosen the man you wanted to marry, but you were too much of a coward to tell him. And do you remember what you said?" His throat tightened at the memory. "I said he'd be a fool not to ask you." "Well," she said, stepping closer until her hands rested against his chest, "I guess it's time to find out if he's really a fool." Before he could respond, she rose up on her tiptoes and kissed him. It was soft and sweet and tasted like coming home after a long journey. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "Loved you since I was 12 years old and you pulled me out of that creek. I just never thought I was worthy of someone like you. Worthy." Cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize she'd shed.
"I'll feed."
"You're worth more than every acre, every dollar, every possession I've ever had or ever will have." Their happiness proved short-lived. 3 days after the auction, as Caspian worked to transfer the ranch deed and settle the Rosecroft debts, disaster struck with the precision of a rattlesnake's bite. Sheriff Morton Blackwood arrived at the ranch just after dawn, his badge glinting in the early sunlight as he rode up the dusty path to the main house. Caspian emerged from the barn, hay still clinging to his work shirt, expecting perhaps news about paperwork or licensing for the upcoming wedding. Instead, he found himself staring down the barrel of a Winchester rifle. Caspian Wilder Blackwood announced in his gravelly voice, "You're under arrest for cattle rustling and fraud." The words hit Caspian like a physical blow. "What, Sheriff? There's been some mistake?" "No mistake, son. I got witness statements saying you've been running stolen cattle with altered brands." Mayor Grimsby himself brought the charges, along with evidence. Blackwood's weathered face showed genuine regret. "I'm sorry, Caspian. Your daddy was a good man. But the evidence is clear." Tobias Ironwood came running from the bunkhouse, along with 3 other ranch hands. "Sheriff, this is insane. Caspian Wilder wouldn't steal so much as a chicken egg. Evidence says otherwise." Blackwood produced a set of iron shackles. "Caspian, you can come quiet or you can come hard. Your choice." The cold metal closed around his wrists. Caspian's mind raced. The timing was too convenient, the charges too perfectly crafted to destroy everything he'd built. Grimsby's threat echoed in his memory. "You'll regret this decision before the week is out," Sheriff Caspian said quietly. "I want to see this. Evidence. You'll see it at your trial. Judge Pemberton's already set it for next Friday." "Next Friday?" Tobias exploded. That's only 4 days. What kind of justice moves that fast? Blackwood's jaw tightened. The kind that wants to clear up territorial business quickly. Too many rustlers running loose lately. They rode toward town. Caspian caught sight of Delphine running down the main street toward them, her green dress billowing behind her like summer leaves. Her face was stricken with terror and disbelief. Caspian. She reached for him, but Blackwood's horse stepped between them. "I'm sorry, Miss Rosecroft. No contact with the prisoner until after trial. This is wrong," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "You know this is wrong." Caspian twisted in his saddle to look back at her. "Delphine, find Judge Morrison in the territorial capital. Tell him what happened. He knew my father. He'll help." "Move along," Blackwood ordered, but his voice lacked conviction. The jail in Willowbrook consisted of 2 cells in the back of the sheriff's office, both designed for drunks and petty thieves rather than long-term prisoners. Caspian found himself locked behind rusted iron bars, staring at stone walls that seemed to close in with each passing hour that evening. Delphine arrived with a basket of food and a face set with grim determination. "Sheriff Blackwood," she said, sweetly, though her eyes promised hellfire, "surely you wouldn't deny a man a last meal from his intended bride." Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I suppose. But I have to stay here while you visit. Rules, of course," Delphine settled. Onto the wooden stool beside Caspian's cell and unwrapped a feast of fried chicken, biscuits, and apple pie. But as she handed items through the bars, she whispered urgent words that made Caspian's blood run cold. "I rode to see Judge Morrison. He's dead, Caspian. Died of a heart attack 3 days ago. His replacement is Judge Cornelius von Sand. He's Mayor Grimsby's brother-in-law." Caspian's appetite vanished. "The evidence?" "Tobias showed me. Someone altered brands on 12 head of cattle in your north pasture, made them look like they belonged to the Morrison Ranch. But Caspian, those cattle have been on your land for years. Remember helping you brand them when they were calves. Can you prove that?" Her face fell. "The brand registry records were destroyed in a fire last month." "Convenient timing." Sheriff Blackwood cleared his throat. "Time's up, Miss Rosecroft." As Delphine packed her basket, she leaned close to the bars. "Don't lose hope," she whispered. "I have an idea, Delphine. Whatever you're thinking, don't do anything dangerous. Promise me." But she was already walking away, her spine straight and her jaw set with the same determination he'd seen when she was 12 years old and trying to catch minnows in the creek. That night, alone in his cell, Caspian stared at the ceiling and contemplated the ruin of everything he'd worked for. Even if he somehow proved his innocence, the trial would delay their wedding indefinitely. Without the ranch to provide income, Delphine and her mother would be destitute within weeks. Grimsby had played his hand perfectly. At dawn on Thursday, the day before his trial, Caspian woke to find his cell door standing open and Sheriff Blackwood slumped unconscious in his chair, a small dart protruding from his neck. Standing in the doorway like an avenging angel was Delphine, dressed in men's clothing and holding a small blowgun that she'd clearly fashioned herself. "Move quickly," she whispered. "Tobias is waiting with horses behind the church." "Delphine, what have you done?" Caspian stared at the unconscious. "Sheriff, this makes us both fugitives. You're already condemned by a rigged trial." She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. "I found something last night. Evidence that will clear your name, but we need time to get it to honest authorities." They slipped through the pre-dawn darkness like shadows, avoiding the main streets and keeping 2 alleyways until they reached the small white church where Tobias waited with 3 saddled horses and a grim expression. "Boss, this is crazy," the foreman muttered as they mounted. "Running makes you look guilty." "Staying makes me hang," Caspian replied. "What did you find, Delphine?" As they rode hard toward the territorial border, Delphine explained her discovery. "I broke into Mayor Grimsby's office last night. He keeps meticulous records of everything including payments. Made 2-3 ranch hands to alter those cattle brands and relocate stolen livestock to your property." "Whose ranch hands?" "His own." Her eyes blazed with fury. "He's been rustling cattle for months, selling them through contacts in Denver." When you outbid him for my hand, he decided to frame you for his own crimes. They rode through the morning, stopping only to rest their horses and grab supplies from a cache Tobias had hidden in an abandoned line shack. By afternoon, they reached the territorial capital of Mountain View, a bustling city of 10,000 souls that represented law and order in the wild frontier. The territorial courthouse was an imposing brick building that dominated the town square. Inside, they found themselves face to face with Marshal Wade Garrison, a legendary lawman whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his skill with a Colt revolver. "So," Garrison drawled after hearing their story and examining Delphine's stolen evidence, "you're telling me that Mayor Grimsby framed you for rustling because you outbid him for a woman?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you, Marshal." Garrison studied the documents Delphine had provided receipts for payments to men named Jerome Pike, Silas Cram, and Doc Mueller, along with detailed records of cattle sales and transport arrangements. "These men," Garrison said finally, "Pike, Cram, and Mueller, they work for Grimsby." "Yes, sir. I've seen them around his property many times." "Well, that's interesting." Garrison opened a desk drawer and withdrew 3 wanted posters. "Pike, Cram, and Mueller are wanted for cattle rustling in 3 different territories. Been looking for them for months." The marshal's weathered face cracked into a grin. "Son, I think you just handed me the evidence I need to clean up a rustling operation that's been plaguing this entire region." Within hours, Marshal Garrison had dispatched a squad of territorial rangers to Willowbrook with warrants for Mayor Grimsby and his accomplices. Meanwhile, Caspian and Delphine found themselves in the strange position of being honored guests rather than fugitives. "There's just one problem," Garrison explained over dinner at the hotel restaurant. "Sheriff Blackwood is pressing charges for jailbreak and assault. It seems he woke up with a powerful headache and a damaged ego." Delphine blushed. "The dart was only meant to make him sleep. I used a recipe from my grandmother's medical journal, willow bark and valerian root. Even so, you'll need to face those charges. But I suspect once this whole mess gets sorted out, any judge with half a brain will throw them out as justifiable under the circumstances." That evening, as they sat on the hotel's front porch, watching the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, Caspian finally allowed himself to believe they might actually survive this ordeal. "You realize," he said to Delphine, "you saved my life tonight. Probably both our lives." "You saved mine 15 years ago when you pulled me out of that creek," she replied, taking his hand. "I've just been returning the favor ever since." "That what this is? A favor?" She turned to face him, her green eyes reflecting the dying light. "No, Caspian Wilder, this is love. The kind that's worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. It's the kind that builds something stronger than any ranch or fortune." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, under the Colorado stars. And for the first time in days, the future looked bright. The news from Willowbrook arrived with the morning stage. Mayor Bartholomew Grimsby had been arrested, along with his 3 accomplices, caught red-handed, attempting to move a herd of stolen cattle toward the Denver markets. Sheriff Blackwood, faced with overwhelming evidence of corruption in his own jurisdiction, had quietly dropped all charges against Caspian and Delphine in exchange for keeping his badge. "Justice, frontier style," Marshal Garrison commented wryly, as he handed Caspian the telegram. "Sometimes it ain't pretty, but it works." The marshal had also arranged for a territorial judge to officiate their wedding, since returning to Willowbrook immediately might prove awkward, given the circumstances. Judge Ezekiel Fairweather was a kindly man in his 70s who'd been performing frontier weddings for longer than Caspian had been alive. "Young man," Judge Fairweather said as they stood in his chambers, "are you absolutely certain you want to marry a woman who broke you out of jail using a homemade blowgun?" "More certain than I've ever been about anything, Your Honor." "And you, Messar? You sure you want to marry a man worth absolutely nothing on paper, but apparently everything in your heart?" Delphine smiled, radiant in the simple white dress she'd purchased that morning. "I've been sure since I was 12 years old, Your Honor." The ceremony was small, but perfect. Tobias served as best man, while the hotel proprietress, Mrs. Evangeline, Harper stood as matron of honor. Marshal Garrison gave the bride away, and Judge Fairweather performed the service with the kind of warmth and dignity that made even the simplest words seem profound. Do you, Caspian Wilder, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and health? For richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live. I do. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he slipped the simple gold band onto Delphine's finger. Do you, Delphine Rosecroft, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and health? For richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? I do. Her voice rang like a bell, clear and strong and full of joy. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. The kiss was sweet and brief, conscious of their small audience, but it carried the promise of forever. Their wedding night was spent in the hotel's finest room, with mountain wildflowers on the windowsill and the sound of a distant creek providing nature's own symphony. They talked long into the night about their future, their dreams, their plans for rebuilding what they'd lost. We'll go back to Willowbrook tomorrow, Caspian said as they lay together, Delphine's head resting on his chest. Face whatever's waiting. For us, what if the ranch is truly gone? What if we can't get it back? Then we'll build something new. Together. He stroked her hair, marveling at the softness of it. I didn't marry you for the ranch, Delphine. I married you because I can't imagine a life without you in it, even if we end up in a one-room cabin with nothing but the clothes on our backs. Especially then. Tilted her chin up so he could see her eyes in the moonlight. Do you know what I realized tonight? All these years I thought the ranch was my legacy, my father's gift to me, but it wasn't. His real gift was teaching me to recognize something worth more than land or money or position. What's that? Love. Real love. The kind that makes you willing to risk everything for another person's happiness. She kissed his chest, right over his heart. Your father would be proud of the man you've become. I hope so. I hope we both make our families proud. They fell asleep, tangled in each other's arms, husband and wife at last, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them in the morning light. But when morning came, brought surprises neither had expected. Tobias arrived before breakfast, with news that would change everything once again. Boss, you need to see this. He handed Caspian a legal document that made the new husband's eyes widen in amazement. What is it? Delphine asked, leaning over to read the papers. It's a court order, Caspian said slowly. Judge Pemberton Grimsby's. Replacement has ruled that since the charges against me were fraudulent, and since the cattle found on my property were actually mine all along, the territorial government is required to compensate me for damages to my reputation and business. Compensate you how much? Caspian looked up with a dazed expression. $15,000, plus full restoration of the ranch deed free and clear. 6 months later, the Wilder Ranch had been transformed from a property on the brink of ruin into one of the most prosperous spreads in 3 territories. The territorial compensation, combined with Caspian's natural business acumen and Delphine's keen eye for detail, had allowed them to expand their operations. Beyond simple cattle ranching, Delphine had convinced her husband to diversify. They now raised horses as well as cattle, grew crops to sell to the mining camps in the mountains, and had even established a small but profitable sideline, providing supplies to travelers passing through. Willowbrook on their way to Denver. The morning sun painted the ranch house golden. As Delphine stood on the wraparound porch that Caspian had built as a wedding gift, watching her husband work with a spirited black stallion in the corral. Even after all these months of marriage, the sight of him still made her heart skip like a stone across water. Mrs. Wilder called a familiar voice. She turned to see Tobias approaching, his weathered face split by an enormous grin. Might want to come see what just arrived? Curious, Delphine followed the foreman to the front yard, where a magnificent carriage stood waiting. Not just any carriage. This was clearly the vehicle of someone wealthy and important. Drawn by 4 perfectly matched chestnuts and attended by liveried servants. The carriage door opened, and out stepped an elegantly dressed woman in her 50s, followed by a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes. Delphine, darling. The woman rushed forward and enveloped her in a perfumed embrace. Oh, my dear child, look at you. Marriage suits you beautifully. Aunt Cordelia? Delphine stared at her father's sister in amazement. What are you doing here? How did you even... No news travels, sweet girl, even to San Francisco. The older woman stepped back, tears glittering in her eyes. When I heard what happened to Oxen, your brave young man's sacrifice, that dreadful business with the false charges, I knew I had to come. The distinguished gentleman cleared his throat gently. Perhaps we should make proper introductions. I'm Theodore Pemberton, Judge Pemberton's cousin, and your aunt's husband as of 2 months ago. Delphine's eyes widened. Husband? Aunt Cordelia, you remarried? At my age? Can you imagine? The older woman laughed, but her cheeks flushed pink with happiness. Theodore swept me off my feet like a schoolgirl, but that's not why we're here. Bye. Now, Caspian had noticed the commotion and approached from the corral. Still carrying his rope and wearing his work clothes, despite being dusty and obviously laboring, he possessed the kind of natural dignity that made Theodore nod approvingly. You must be the famous Caspian Wilder, Theodore said, extending his hand. I've heard quite a lot about you, young man. All of it impressive, sir. Caspian shook the offered hand, his eyes questioning. Cordelia clasped her hands together in delight. Theodore, dear, show them. Theodore reached into his coat and withdrew an official-looking document. Mr. Wilder, your wife's aunt has asked me to present you with this. Consider it a belated wedding gift. Caspian unfolded the papers, Delphine reading over his shoulder. What they saw made them both gasp in astonishment. It's the deed to the old Morrison Ranch, Delphine whispered. All 20,000 acres. The Morrison family decided to sell after old Judge Morrison's death, Theodore explained. When Cordelia learned of your situation, she convinced me to purchase it on your behalf. Consider it an investment in young love and frontier enterprise. Caspian stared at the document, then at his wife, then at their unexpected benefactors. Sir, ma'am, we can't possibly accept this. It's too much nonsense. Cordelia waved dismissively. Theodore is richer than Midas and twice as generous. Besides, this isn't Charity's family taking care of family. Delphine's the daughter. I never had, and that makes you my son. There is one condition, Theodore added with a slight smile. You must promise to name your first son after me. Delphine and Caspian exchanged a meaningful look. Her hand moved instinctively to her still flat stomach, and Caspian's eyes widened with understanding. Well, Delphine said softly, if it's a boy, Theodore Wilder has a wonderful sound to it. And if it's a girl... She looked at her aunt with shining eyes. Cordelia is a beautiful name. Aunt Cordelia let out a squeal of joy that could probably be heard in Denver. Oh, my dears, how wonderful. When early spring, we think, Caspian said, his arm sliding around his wife's waist. We just found out ourselves last week. The sun set that evening, the expanded Wilder family blood relations, and chosen, family alike, gathered on the porch for a celebration dinner that Mrs. Harper had prepared with the help of every woman in Willowbrook. The table groaned under the weight of roasted chickens, fresh bread, garden vegetables, 3 different kinds of pie. Judge Fairweather had ridden down from the territorial capital to join them, along with Marshal Garrison and even Sheriff Blackwood, who had become something of a friend once the dust settled from the Grimsby affair. You know, Marshal Garrison said as he raised his glass of apple cider, in 30 years of law enforcement, I've seen a lot of stories, but I've never seen love triumph over corruption quite so spectacularly. Here's to love, Judge Fairweather, added, his own glass raised high, and to the courage it takes to fight for what matters most. 2 second chances, Sheriff Blackwood contributed quietly. And to folks who believe in redemption. To family, Aunt Cordelia said, her voice thick with emotion. Both the kind you're born with and the kind you choose. Caspian stood, pulling Delphine up beside him. To my wife, he said simply, who taught me that the greatest treasures can't be bought, sold, or stolen. They can only be freely given and gratefully received. Delphine looked around the table at all the faces glowing in the lantern light, people who had become their chosen family, their community, their support system through trials that had tested their love and emerged stronger. To all of you, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air, who showed us that when people stand together, justice prevails, love conquers, and happy endings aren't just for fairy tales. As they clinked glasses and began their feast, the sound of laughter and conversation drifted across the valley, where Caspian and Delphine had first met as children by the creek. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began to sing, and the stars appeared one by one in the vast Colorado sky. Later that night, as their guests departed with promises to return for the baby's arrival in spring, Caspian and Delphine walked hand in hand to their favorite spot by Cottonwood Creek. The water babbled softly over smooth stones, just as it had 15 years ago when a gangly girl had tried to catch minnows with her bare hands. "Do you ever wonder," Delphine asked, settling into her husband's arms, "what would have happened if you hadn't jumped into that creek to save me all those years ago?" "I wouldn't have had to jump," Caspian replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You always could swim just fine. You were just waiting for me to realize you were worth diving in for." She laughed, the sound like silver bells in the night air. "You know me too well, Caspian Wilder, not well enough?" 60 years learning everything there is to know about my wife. Only 60 years. "Well," he said, tilting her chin up so he could see her face in the moonlight, "I suppose we could negotiate for 70. Maybe 80 if you're very good." "Deal," she whispered, and kissed him under the stars. In the months and years that followed, the Wilder Ranch became legendary throughout the territory, not just for its prosperity, but for the love story that had created it. Theodore Wilder was born the following spring, followed 2 years later by little Cordelia, then by twins they named Hope and Justice, in honor of the principles that had guided their parents through their darkest hours. Caspian and Delphine grew old together, their love deepening with each passing season. They weathered droughts and blizzards, market crashes and cattle diseases, always side by side. Always partners in every sense of the word. And sometimes, on summer evenings when the fireflies danced over Cottonwood Creek, their grandchildren would beg for the story of how Grandpa had bid his whole life for Grandma at an auction, and how Grandma had broken him out of jail with a homemade blowgun, how love had conquered all the forces arrayed against them. It was the children always. Agreed. The very best kind of fairy tale, the kind that was absolutely true. Mayor Grimsby, for his part, spent 5 years in territorial prison and emerged a broken man who lived out his remaining days as a clerk in a Denver dry goods store. His mansion on the hill was purchased by the territorial government and converted into a school for girls, a fitting irony that Delphine particularly enjoyed. The auction platform where their story had truly begun was eventually torn down and replaced by a beautiful gazebo where young couples came to pledge their love. Inspired by the legend of Caspian and Delphine Wilder, the ranch hand who had known her since girlhood and bid his life for her at auction, and the woman who had loved him enough to risk everything to save his. Their love story became the stuff of legend, told and retold around campfires and in parlors throughout the American West, a testament to the power of true love to triumph over corruption, its adversity, and the cruel machinations of lesser hearts. And if you visit Willowbrook Valley today, locals will still point out the creek where it all began, the ranch where they built their empire of love, and the little white church where their descendants still gather every summer to celebrate the anniversary of the greatest love story the frontier had ever known.